Hi, everybody. I'm David Payne. I am a Twitch streamer, a father, a writer, like most of us. Um, the story I'm starting to read today is the first chapter of the story Fish. Um, it is a fantasy story, though I will give you a little bit of heads up that there is not going to be a single fantasy element within this particular chapter. Um, the fantasy elements come in later in the story, much to the surprise of the human inhabitants. Um, the story itself is, I don't know, it started off at around 50,000 words, but it's probably been edited down a little bit from there. Um, but it's a story I'm planning on doing quite a bit of work on and sending it out from here. So this is only the second draft of it, though. So, chapter one. Torin woke up as he did on most days. It was still in the darkness of the fourth quarter of the day, groggy, tired, not really ready to get up and out of his bed. A rough bed of straw covered with a sheet that scratched his skin uncomfortably. His uncomfortable bed was all he had known, though, and even though he knew there were more comfortable things in the world, he just knew that his bed was destined to always be this uncomfortable. That's just the way it was in a backwoods, no-name village like Qual. All of the people he knew also had horrible beds, replacing the straw once a season to keep it fresh, but otherwise accepting that their lot in life was to sleep in a way that left them tired the next day. Not everyone woke up in the darkness of the fourth quarter. That was something that Torin, his father, and the other fishermen of Qual were fairly unique for. They needed to get out to the boats and get them ready for the day's fishing, and that meant actually starting on the day before. And that's just the way it was for Torin. He'd gotten up with his father for fishing every day since he had come of age, 2 years before. Sure, he'd done his service to the town, in the form of the forced enlistment for a year once he turned 15, but after that he was considered an adult in the town, and an adult needed to earn his keep. And as much as he always did the job, always got up each day, he hated fishing. Torin didn't know anything other than fishing, though, and so he figured his lot in life left him fishing, and that's just how it was going to be. This morning, Torin got himself out of bed and shook off the night sweat, used his chamber pot and dumped it out the window, dressed quickly in the brisk air of the night, and was soon into the family's common area. Like most nights, his father, Anders, was already in the common area, cooking a fish for a quick bite to eat. Torin tolerated eating fish because it was something they always had. He didn't particularly like it, but he knew better than to make a fuss about it each day. At least his father still made him the fish each day. His friends were already on their own, and having to make their own food and to make their own way once they came of age. Torin knew he was lucky to have a father to still make him food, even if that luck meant he'd eat a fish every fourth quarter, before he'd head out to the boat to start the work that he didn't particularly like. "Mornin'," his father said as he came into the common area. The word was almost a whisper, drowned out by the sizzle of the fish in the pan. "Get some fishin' done today," he added. Not a question, just a statement. And it was what his father said just about every day. His father was barely lit by a lantern he used every day, the flame set very low so as to not disturb Torin's siblings, who were asleep on the floor not 2 meters away. "Yeah," Torin responded. "Morning and fishing." Torin used to puzzle over his father saying morning to him. Morning didn't start until first quarter. Fourth quarter, when it was still darker than the darkest caves, that was still night. He knew better than to argue about it now, though. When he was younger, it earned him some stern words, and occasionally the loss of his meal. His stomach grumbled at the smell of the fish, at least, so some part of his body knew it was time to eat. Torn grabbed a mug out of the cupboard and poured some water into it from a pitcher his father likely filled when he got up from the well in the center of the village. He took a long draught from it, feeling the cool water flow down his throat, soaking up the cobwebs of sleep and helping his eyes to stay a little more open. He finished the first mugful and poured himself a second. He noticed his father didn't have a mug for himself yet. "Want some?" he asked, indicating the mug. His father didn't look up, just nodded slightly. Thorin took out a second mug and poured it full for him and handed it over to his father. Thanks. Anders kept cooking the fish, flipping it once and then serving it out on two plates. Simple wooden affairs that they used every morning and for every meal. Thorin didn't get tired of the plates, though. The fish, on the other hand, was not something he looked forward to. Anders handed a plate to Thorin and took the lantern over to the simple table and sat down in the simply made wooden chairs. Thorin knew others had better chairs, but he was comfortable with these two chairs, and while he and Anders didn't always see the same things the same ways, he did enjoy sitting with his father on days like these. It was a connection he knew others didn't have, and he did appreciate it. Eating in the relative darkness was with only the one lantern with the flame down low, it helped preserve a sense of silence in the room while they ate. Anders ate slowly, deliberately. Thorin used to count the number of chews his father did before swallowing, but realized very quickly that he wasn't bored enough to use that as entertainment. Thorin, on the other hand, ate methodically, efficiently, but not messily, and certainly not noisily. He would have he always he would always have the next bite on his fork by the time he swallowed the previous bite, and when he was done, he cleared his plate, leaving the bones in the pile for stock, and rinsed off his plate with a little water from his mug, and then finished the rest of the water he poured for himself. By the time he was done with this regular routine, he could swear his father was only on his second bite. As an adult, though, he no longer had expectations to stay at the table while his father finished his meal. As such, Thorin cleaned up anything that lingered behind for himself, put on his sturdy boots, a heavy coat fashioned from fish skin and insulated with goat hair and sheep wool, and was out the door a minute later. Thorin paused just outside the door, taking in the cool air like a blanket, adjusting to the slight difference in the cool air of autumn from the cool air inside the home. His siblings always had the heat of the stove. Thorin kept warm at night with a heavy quilt he earned when he finished his service. During the height of winter, he expected he would need to find a better solution, though. The winters were cold, and he had always had the heat of the stove to warm him before. It was a problem he would solve later, though. Maybe by then he would move out on his own. Qual was the smallest of small villages. Although Lord Drac kept a small garrison here for protection, the village had no walls and little need for one in Torrin's memory. History told him that the valley was one of the most contested lands in all the realms, but the last conflict had been before his father's time, and maybe even before his father's father's time. To him, the requirement of enlistment was a strange custom, but he at least enjoyed it more than fishing. He missed the rigors of enlistment. Torrin made his way past four small homes on his course to the docks. They were each similar to his own home, simple, wood-framed homes that had 2 or 3 rooms inside, a large common area, and one, maybe 2 bedrooms. Torrin knew he was lucky to have his own room now that he was an adult. Before then, he had slept in the common room with his siblings, and the other room was where they kept their tools, and whatever food they kept for long-term storage. In fact, they still kept the tools stored there, but Torrin did what he could to ignore them. His room did smell like salted fish on warm days, though. He liked the cooler weather of autumn for that at least. None of the other homes had any sign of movement or light in them. Torrin walked by himself down to the docks, sloshing through some puddles in his boots that he didn't question too carefully, since they hadn't had rain in a few days. He noted to himself to stick them in the lake to wash them off before he got on the boat. The docks were one of the few things built up in Qual. Long ago, some stonemasons had fashioned them, first by putting down large boulders they rolled in from the mountains, and then shaped and chiseled away until they were flat and mostly uniform. Thorin didn't know when they had been constructed, but given how much the stone had worn away, he guessed they were hundreds of years old. That kind of timekeeping was beyond his ability to reason, though. Old was good enough. The docks featured 4 spans, along which the boats were secured. None of these boats were the huge boats of the open ocean. They were utilitarian, mostly storage vessels that could haul a good amount of fish in a short time. Thorin and Anders would hire a few boat hands each season to help with the catch, in order to build up enough stock for the winter months, and save themselves from having to go out in the bitter cold, to both make a living and to catch what food they would need to survive. None of the boat hands were at the docks yet, though, which disappointed Torin. He didn't like being the first. That just meant he had to do the work on his own. Still, still, Torin set to work immediately. He had nets to clean and sort through. He had bait to cut and store. He swabbed the deck, polished the wood railings, and didn't particularly notice when the two boat hands, Reg and Dan, arrived and started doing what needed doing. They worked on in silence, and Torin only noted them when he decided he could slow down. Sitting for a moment, he realized that most of the other boats at the docks, 7 fishing boats and 3 ferries, were all bustling with the morning business. He waved at his mate Sor, who was working on the boat next to his. They were roughly the same age and had grown a friendship during their service time and hung out in their downtime. Fishermen tended to keep different hours than most of the rest of the village, so while the farmers and miners were often working until late in the third quarter, Torn and Sor were done by second quarter, and that afforded them some time to relax. Sometimes. Anders would often tell them that relaxing was a way to get into trouble. Anders came to the docks with 3 other boat captains, just as fourth quarter was letting up into first. Anders knew all of the fishermen in the village very well, and they often coordinated so they didn't need to worry about nets getting tangled or any other trouble. Anders was the most senior of all the captains in town, having been fishing since he was just a boy himself, and taking over captain's duties when his father fell ill when he was 16. Anders had just finished his service, and while it might have crushed others to lose their father so early, Anders threw himself into the fishing and never stopped. They took the boat out after the toll of the first quarter bell from the village square. The bell was an ancient thing that the town used to toll the changing of the quarters on each day, and the building in which it resided was older still. Torin learned that the tower itself was one of the early warning towers the villages had erected in order to call for help from all around the lake in ages past. In his lifetime, he had never seen it used for that purpose, but he imagined that the bell tolling could be heard for quite some distance. He didn't reflect on it too much, but he had never heard the tolling from other bells in other villages, even the closest ones. He wondered if they even had functioning bells anymore. Once the boat was pushed off from the dock, it was Torin and the 2 boat hands who drove it forward, with long oars and broad leaves to propel it. Anders took the rudder and steered them toward their nets they had set up overnight. Torin always felt like it took hours to get out to the nets each morning, situated as they were far from the shore, and the boat moved slower than slugs, even on a good day. Pulling the oars was just part of his job, though, so he kept at it. The morning sun was pulling over the mountains that blocked it for the first part of first quarter, illuminating the still waters with twinkles of gold and silver, making the water darker where it wasn't lit up in comparison. Torin loved this part of the morning, and often his oar would slow as he looked on. Anders called him out on it on some days, but not on this particular day. Torin watched some gulls fly overhead, heading to the western shore of the lake. He watched bugs dance on the surface of the lake, trying to soak up some of the sun's light, only to be gobbled up by a fish ambushing the bugs from below. The living bugs scattered away, but the fish was well fed. Part of the circle of life, Torn supposed. But he wondered what life was like to the bug, to the fish. Maybe it was more exciting than his own. Pretty much anything else would be, he decided. Torrin pulled the boat up to their first net. They set up 3 nets each night, pulling them up, emptying them, and then resetting the area with a new net before moving on to the next one. They only needed to check the nets once a day, and usually they were fruitful catches up until late autumn. Since it was still mid autumn, Anders and Torn were expecting a heavy net. And expectations are sometimes dashed aside unexpectedly. The 2 boat hands pulled up the net with the aid of Torrin at the hand crane, and were very surprised to see the net was nearly empty. They pulled the net the rest of the way onto the boat and dumped its contents onto the table they set up for sorting. Anders was looking on from the captain's chair, and Torrin thought he heard him make a grunt of disapproval. Torrin looked up at him for guidance, but his father said nothing. Torrin set the 2 boat hands to sorting the fish while he took a closer look at the net. He didn't see anything wrong with it at first glance, but he decided he would need to spend some time repairing it, because it clearly had a tear somewhere. 12? The boat hand called up to Anders. This time Torn definitely heard Anders's grunt. This wasn't good at all. Maybe the next one would be better? Torn could only hope. Torn pulled the net he had set up before they set out, and attached it to the crane, and then lowered it into the water. Had he set up the net wrong yesterday? He found himself second guessing every action he took. He knew those nets. He knew these nets from every angle, from every knot they had. No, there was something else at play here. A rip, a cut. Maybe one of the other fishermen had sabotaged their net? But Torrin didn't see anyone else close enough that could have possibly done so, and Anders was so well respected in the village that Torrin had a hard time even picturing someone doing that to him. With the new net set up, Torrin detached the crane from it and took his place at the oar. 12 fish was not close to what they needed. 10 times that much was normal, and they had seen 20 times as much on good days. Torrin had never seen a count so low, never in his life. Torrin found himself dreading the approach to the second net, but pulled up alongside and prepared for the pull. He talked up the boat hands, trying to keep their spirits up while keeping his own up, though which was further down, he couldn't be sure. The boat hands began hauling, and Torrin cranked the crane, one turn at a time. Time slowed for him, it seemed. He just couldn't bear another bad count. The top of the net crested the railing, and then more and more, and eventually Torrin could see fish, but again, the net was not full, not even a third full, not even a tenth. The three men pulled the net over the table and detached it and opened it so its contents spilled out over the expanse. Torrin didn't need to count to know that the number was going to be greater than 12, but he knew as well it wasn't going to be much more. His job wasn't the count, though, so he worked on detaching the net, checking it for obvious problems, and then setting it aside and getting the new net ready for deployment. He kept looking up at his father, wondering what he was thinking, and wondering if he had been the one to mess things up. Or if he hadn't messed things up, if his father would blame him for it anyway. 11. The call came as a surprise to Torrin, but he watched the boat hands take a bunch of the catch and throw it over the railing. Too many smalls, he realized. 23 fish was not enough to last a day in the village. Their own take was 15 usually, a few fresh, and then the rest to salt and store for the winter. Stop resting down there. We got another net to get, Anders called down, anger deep in the recesses of the command, and Torn broke out of his reverie, set the net to the crane, and waited for the boat hands to pull it over the rail. Once they did, he lowered it down. They detached it, and then back to the oar to head to the last net. Torn knew the last net would be like the others. Maybe the other fishermen in town would have fared better. Maybe this was just isolated to this part of the lake, Torn wondered. Maybe they should have set their nets in a new spot. But they pulled on and up to the last net. Torn looked grimly into the water, hoping he could see a good catch below, but he knew he wouldn't be able to see the net from the surface. The only thing he could see was the buoy they used to keep the attachment afloat so they could pull it up. He did as he had done on the other two, pulling up the net with the crane, one turn at a time, hoping against hope it would have better news coming than the first two. This net was at least more full than the last two, but Torn dreaded that maybe it would be full of smalls, or maybe just filled with weeds and lake grass as he saw a few strands poking out here and there. They dumped the haul on the table, and Torn forced himself to focus on the net, as if by ignoring the table he could will the count to be higher, or that maybe ignoring it would make it not his fault somehow. He knew it wasn't his fault, but deep in his body he felt it would be his fault anyway. Something wasn't right, and that would make it his fault in the end. This net was just like the previous two. He couldn't find any tears or rips that would have prevented a good catch. He shook his head, looking up at Anders, who could have been a statue up there in his chair by the rudder, and then back down to the net. He detached it, put on the next net, and was ready to deploy it before the boat hands had finished. Unable to move further in his task, he had to look at the table then, and there he saw a small pile of fish to keep, a larger pile of smalls that had to be tossed back. The count was still not good. 22. The words ate at Torin from the inside, resonating in his bowels. He couldn't bear what that would mean. The haul wasn't even enough to feed the locals, and therefore they wouldn't have enough to send on and get some coin for their efforts. Torn could only hope that this was just one oddity for the whole season. Yesterday's counts were fine, though, right? He hadn't thought about them until now, and he couldn't remember the exact numbers. Maybe they had been low. If they were, Anders hadn't specifically mentioned them. They set the last net down and started turning the boat around, but Anders stopped them. Paddle out until I tell you to stop, he said. Thorin didn't know what that meant until Anders told them to set up a fourth net as they went. We won't have enough for tomorrow, then. Just do it. Thorin, dutiful, did as he was told. He set down his oar and cleaned out the first net they had pulled up, double checking for any needed repairs, cut some additional bait, and put it into the trap. By the time he was finished, Anders called for them to stop. Set it here. Torn didn't know what was in the voice. Not anger. Frustration, maybe? He wasn't sure. Still, the three of them pulled the net to the edge, and Torn lowered it into the water. It disappeared into the depths, and Torn wished that tomorrow's haul would be better. Anything more than this had to be better. Have you ever had a count so low? Dan asked. Torn froze while Anders considered his answer. No, Anders said. Then, all right, let's get home and get this haul unloaded. And that was that. The three of them on the oars pulled, and Anders steered them home to the shore. At the dock, their work wasn't done, and while the others cleaned the boat, Torn spent all of his time with the nets. Anders came down and picked up a corner himself. No rips or tears? Nothing. Hmm. Hopefully the others had a better haul then. Anders left the boat and his son behind, heading up the dock and then up toward their home. Torn and the two boat hands spent their efforts on cleaning up the boat, unloading the fish, packing the ones for storage, and keeping aside the ones that would be kept fresh. By the time they were done with their efforts, two other fishermen had come back in, including the boat where Sor worked. Torn caught his eye as they pulled in, and could see that they also didn't have a good haul to bring ashore. The captains all left their boats earlier than usual, and they all headed up to Anders's home. Torn had never seen such grim determination on their faces before. What did it all mean?